What if a demon crept into your loneliest loneliness and said to you, "This life as you live it now and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more"? These are Nietzsche's words, section 341 of The Gay Science. He called this thought his greatest and his heaviest. Most people hear it as a question. Would you be willing? Could you endure it? Nietzsche meant it as something else entirely, not simply a question, more like a verdict. And if you understand what he actually meant, not the philosophy lecture version, not the thought experiment, but what this idea reveals about the condition of the soul that encounters it, you will never read your own life the same way again. Before we dive in, if this kind of content resonates with you, come find me at luminaryflow.com. There's a free gift waiting for you. You'll find the link in the top comment below. Now let's get back into it. Imagine you were given that choice. The demon arrives. He lays your life before you, every moment, every decision, every ordinary afternoon, and tells you this is what recurs, forever, without alteration. Most people, when they first encounter this idea, feel something, kind of weight, an instinctive recoil, and that recoil tells them something about themselves they weren't expecting. That is precisely why the thought experiment has endured. It confronts you with your life as a totality, not as a series of individual choices still in progress, but as a completed thing, a whole, something that has already assumed its shape. And in doing so, it asks a question most of us spend considerable energy avoiding. Is this a life you would choose? Even in its reduced form, the idea has genuine weight. But notice what the thought experiment version asks you to do. It asks you to stand outside your life and evaluate it, as a spectator, to access it from a distance, to weight it as if from somewhere above it. And that's precisely what Nietzsche was arguing against. Think about what the philosophical literature has done with this idea. It has made it a test of psychological resilience, a measure of whether you can accept suffering, whether you are strong enough to say yes to the full weight of your existence, even its worst moments. There is also a version of this question that circulates in self-help frameworks, in the language of radical acceptance, stoic endurance. That version has its uses, but it has almost nothing to do with what Nietzsche meant. Because the thought experiment reading places you in the position of a judge, reviewing a verdict already handed down. You are the observer, the life is the object, and your task is to determine whether you can bear it. Nietzsche was not asking whether you could bear your life. He had a far more unsettling question in mind. Consider what actually happened in Sils-Maria in August of 1881. Nietzsche was walking along the lake at Silvaplana, alone, as he usually was in those years, when the thought struck him with the force of what he later described as revelation. He stopped. He sat on a pyramidal rock beside the path, and something shifted. He did not write the thought down immediately. He carried it for months. He called it his most abyssal idea. Not because it was dark, but because it was true. And because most people, when they feel its full weight, instinctively look away. Imagine sitting beside the lake. Imagine the thought arriving, not as an abstract proposition, but as a recognition. Not what if this recurred, but this already is recurring, and you never noticed. There is a different thought entirely. That something is missing from the version most people encounter. Because what Nietzsche had seen, what the vision above Sils-Maria had shown him, was not a question about your future. It was a revelation about what's already happening to everyone without their knowledge. Consider what every serious mystical tradition has understood beneath its particular language and cosmology. The unredeemed soul does not need to imagine eternal recurrence. It's already living it. Not in the literal sense, not the same events repeating in sequence, but in the deeper sense that matters. The same configurations of desire, the same avoidances, the same particular quality of distance from its own existence. The soul that has not claimed itself returns, not because an external force compels it, but because unlived life generates its own gravity. It pulls toward repetition the way water pulls toward its own level. The Gnostics understood this with unusual precision. In their cosmology, the soul caught within the archonic system does not simply suffer, it forgets. It returns to the same patterns, not through conscious choice, but through the absence of it. The archons do not need to drag the soul back, they only need to maintain the conditions of forgetfulness. And the soul, unaware of what it is and what it carries, does the rest. Imagine the person who has lived 40 years this way, not suffering exactly, not destroyed, simply enduring, moving through a life they have never fully said yes to, meeting its demands, managing its complications, surviving its losses, but never at any point actually entering it, never claiming it as their own. This is not a failure of willpower, it's not a moral failing, it is what happens to a soul that has not yet awakened to the weight of its own existence. And precisely this, is what Nietzsche saw. Not a future scenario requiring your evaluation, a present condition requiring your recognition. The eternal return, in its deepest register, is not a philosophical hypothesis. It is a description of what is already happening. The cycle does not begin when the demon speaks. The cycle is already running. The demon simply makes it visible. Why would Nietzsche call this his heaviest thought and also his most liberating? Because the moment you see the cycle, you're no longer entirely inside it. Recognition is the first movement out of automaticity. But recognition alone is not sufficient. What comes next is the demand that almost no one meets. Think about what it would actually mean to will the eternal return, not to accept it. Nietzsche had no patience for mere acceptance. Acceptance is what you offer to something you cannot change. It's a posture of resignation dressed in the language of peace. Nietzsche despised it. In the Stoics, in the Christians, in the secular variants that inherited their logic. To will the return is something categorically different. It's the active, unconditional, total endorsement of your existence. Not what it could have been, not what it might yet become, but what it has been, precisely as it has been, without remainder. He called this Amor fati, love of fate, and the distinction between loving your fate and accepting your fate is not a subtle one. Consider the person who has suffered a significant loss. Acceptance says, this happened, I cannot change it, I will integrate it and move forward. That is already a mature response. Most people never reach it. But Amor fati says something harder. It says, I would not have it otherwise. Not because the loss was not real, not because the suffering was not genuine, but because this life, this specific, unrepeatable configuration of events, is the only life in which I exist. To wish it otherwise is to wish myself otherwise, and I do not. This is not a position most people can honestly occupy, and Nietzsche knew it. Can you will the eternal return of your existence is not a question about its psychological strength. It's a diagnostic. It reveals with surgical precision the gap between the life you have inhabited and the life you have merely managed. Because here is what the question actually uncovers. You cannot honestly will the recurrence of a life you have never fully entered. The soul that recoils from the eternal return, that feels the weight of the demon's words as unbearable, it's not a weak soul, it's an honest one. It is recognizing, perhaps for the first time, how much of its own existence it has held at arm's length. This is where the teaching becomes genuinely demanding. Most people, when they encounter the eternal return, instinctively reframe it. They ask, which parts could I will to recur? The good moments, the peak experiences, the relationships that felt real, they construct an edited version, a highlight reel, and try to will that. Nietzsche would have seen through it immediately. The eternal return admits no editing, no curation, no selection of the acceptable portions. It is the whole or it is nothing. And that totality is precisely the point, because the question is not whether you can will the return of your best moments. The question is whether your existence, taken as a complete and unalterable whole, has the quality of something you have genuinely inhabited. That remainder, the unedited whole, is the measure. Modern depth psychology echoes with this with a different vocabulary. What Nietzsche described as the soul's tendency toward unconscious recurrence, Jung's clinical work mapped as repetition compulsion, the psyche's drive to recreate the conditions of its unresolved territory. Not because the psyche wants to suffer, but because it moves with extraordinary persistence toward what has not yet been consciously inhabited. The patterns you did not choose consciously, you will repeat unconsciously. The relationship dynamic you have never examined will reappear in the next relationship, wearing a different face. The avoidance you have never named will generate the same situations, in different forms, until you do. The cycle does not pause while you look away. It simply continues without your authorship. This is not mystical speculation. It is measurable in the consulting room, predictable enough to be the basis of an entire therapeutic tradition. The unconscious repetition of unintegrated material is one of the most robust findings in the history of psychology. What Nietzsche intuited through philosophical vision, depth psychology confirmed through clinical observation. The soul that cannot will the eternal return of its existence is, in the language of depth psychology, a soul still governed by repetition compulsion, still running the cycle, still returning, not by choice, but by default. The only question the eternal return poses is whether you will make the return conscious. And so here is what Nietzsche is actually asking. Not, would you choose this life again? That question still positions you as an observer standing outside your existence, weighing it from a comfortable distance. That question still allows you to manage the encounter, to evaluate rather than enter. The real question is this: have you ever, even once, lived a single moment you could honestly call your own? A moment you inhabited so completely, with such total presence and unconditional commitment, that you would not trade it, soften it, or escape it. A moment that required nothing to be other than it was. For most people, the honest answer is no. Not because their lives have been without value, but because they have been present to their lives the way a visitor is present to a foreign country. Observing, sampling, always slightly removed from the full weight of where they actually are. And Nietzsche knew this. He saw it in the culture around him. He saw it in the philosophical tradition he had inherited. He saw it, if his letters are any indication, in himself. The eternal return was not a consolation. It was not designed to make you feel better about your life. It was designed to make the question of how you're living it impossible to avoid. Picture this: you're no longer a visitor to your own existence. You're its inhabitant, its author. Every moment lands with its full weight because you're no longer calculating your escape from it. You are inside it entirely. That is the condition from which you could will the return. That is what Nietzsche was pointing toward. And it is, as it turns out, a condition that every serious contemplative tradition has also pointed toward, using an entirely different language and arriving at a conclusion that looks on the surface like the opposite. Imagine this: you have begun the work, not the performance of the work, not the reading of the books, the acquisition of the vocabulary, the curating of the spiritual self-image, but the actual work, the descent into what you have been avoiding, the encounter with what Jung called the shadow, the unlived life, the refused possibilities, the qualities you disowned because they were inconvenient or frightening or simply too much. You integrate something genuinely shifts, and then, with a timing that can feel almost cruel, the same territory appears again. A different relationship, a different circumstance, a different phase, but recognizably the same archetypal pressure, the same invitation wearing different clothes. This is not failure, this is the structure of the path itself. We do not escape the cycle through individuation. We change our relationship to it. The spiral returns us to the same territory, but we are not the same substance that first entered it. What was once unconscious pattern is now conscious encounter. What once happened to us now happens through us. The territory has not changed, we have changed, and so the territory means something different. Consider what this looks like in practice. The person who has genuinely integrated a shadow element does not stop encountering it in their outer life. The patterns are still there in their relationship, in their work, in the particular irritations and fascinations that mark the edges of what they have not yet fully owned. But they meet these patterns differently, with recognition rather than reaction, with the capacity to pause at the threshold of the old response and choose otherwise. That capacity, that quality of conscious inhabitation in the moment, is what the spiral is building. Not immunity to the cycle, authorship within it. And this is precisely what Nietzsche was pointing toward with the eternal return. Not escape from recurrence, transformation of your relationship to it. The same life, but now fully entered. The same moments, but now fully claimed. That quality, that sense of having inhabited rather than merely survived, is what Nietzsche meant by being able to will the return. How much of what you call your inner life is genuine encounter, and how much is careful management of the encounter you're not yet ready to have. This isn't abstract philosophy. It is the difference between a life that leaves a remainder, something unlived, something avoided, something perpetually deferred, and a life that does not. Between a life the soul has moved through and a life the soul has actually entered. The alchemical tradition understood something about this that modern psychology is still catching up to. The great work, the opus magnum, does not begin with construction. It begins with dissolution. The first stage is not the building of something new. It is the complete breaking down of what already exists, the solutio, the return of all fixed forms of prima materia, the raw, undifferentiated substance from which something genuinely new might emerge. The alchemist does not flee the dissolution. They do not manage it from a safe distance. They descend into it, willingly, with full knowledge of what it costs. Because the alchemical insight, the one that gives the whole tradition its particular gravity, is this: you cannot transmute what you have not fully entered. The philosopher's stone is not found above the cycle of dissolution and recombination. It is found at the center of it. It is what remains when everything that was not essential has been dissolved away. The alchemical tradition understood that transformation requires total dissolution first. Nietzsche's eternal return is the Western philosophical equivalent of solutio. It asks you to go so completely into your existence, to say yes so unconditionally to the whole of what your life has been, that the cycle no longer runs you from outside. You become its source. You author the recurrence rather than suffering it. And here's the tension that makes this idea genuinely difficult to hold. Every other serious tradition says, get out of the cycle. Buddhism, in its deepest current, points toward the cessation of return. Nirvana as the extinguishing of the conditions that generate rebirth. Gnosticism, as we have seen, frames the cycle as archonic captivity. The goal is to pass through the celestial spheres and return to the pleroma. The Vedantic traditions, in their various forms, orient the seeker toward moksha, liberation from the wheel of samsara. These are not naive traditions. They have mapped the interior landscapes with extraordinary precision over thousands of years. Nietzsche alone said, "Go so deeply into the cycle that you author it." And this is not, as it might appear, a contradiction to the mystical path. It is its Western phase. Because what every mystical tradition requires at the threshold of genuine transformation is total commitment to the present reality of the soul's condition. You cannot transcend what you have not fully faced. You cannot be liberated from what you have not completely entered. The Gnostic who flees the archons without understanding them is still governed by them. The Buddhist who seeks nirvana as an escape from suffering rather than a transformation of relationship to it has missed the point the tradition was making. The alchemist who wants the stone without the solutio has confused the goal for the path. Nietzsche made the descent unavoidable. That was his contribution. This isn't mystical speculation. The soul that cannot will the recurrence of its own existence is already, in the language of depth psychology, a soul in repetition compulsion, already returning, already running the cycle. The difference between the person who has worked with the eternal return as a genuine practice and the person who has not is not a difference in what recurs. It is a difference in who is authoring the recurrence. One is returning by default, the other is returning by choice. And the gap between those two positions is the entire distance of the inner work. Consider what changes the moment you take this seriously, not as a thought experiment you entertain and set aside, not as an interesting philosophical provocation, but as a practice, as the actual lens through which you encounter your own life moment by moment. You stop asking, "How do I endure this?" That question, however understandable, still positions you outside your own experience, as a spectator calculating how much weight you can bear before you need to step away. It is the question of someone who has not yet entered their life. You begin asking something different, something harder. Have I actually entered this? Have I claimed this moment, this relationship, this difficulty, this particular configuration of what my life actually is? Or have I only managed it? Have I been present to it? Or have I been waiting for it to resolve into something more comfortable before I allow myself to fully arrive? We are extraordinarily sophisticated in our methods of not arriving. We process our experiences, we analyze them, we discuss them. We build elaborate frameworks for understanding them. And all of this activity, earnest, intelligent, sometimes genuinely useful, can become its own form of distance. A way of engaging with life that preserves the careful gap between the self and what is actually happening to it. The eternal return closes the gap. It makes the gap costly in a way that is impossible to rationalize away, because if this moment, exactly as it is, unedited and unimproved, is what recurs, then the distance you are maintaining from it is not neutral. It is the precise measure of what you are refusing to inhabit. The eternal return does not add weight to your life. It reveals how little weight you have been willing to carry. What would it mean to carry the full weight of a single ordinary moment? Not a peak experience, not a revelation, just this whatever is immediately present, held without the impulse to improve it, escape it, or file it away for later processing. Most of us have never done it, not completely. Not without some residual calculation running in the background, some part of ourselves still held in reserve. And Nietzsche is asking whether, even once, we might. The demon returns, not as a threat, not as a test of endurance, as a mirror held up without commentary to the full weight of what you have or have not inhabited. The vision above Sils-Maria was not a philosophical puzzle requiring a solution. It was a moment of recognition so complete that Nietzsche could not unknow it. The cycle was already running. It had always been running. The only question was whether he, or whether anyone, would ever author it consciously rather than simply endure it. We do not escape that question by answering it once. It returns, the way all genuine questions return, at the threshold of every moment we are tempted to manage rather than enter. The spiral does not resolve, it deepens, and the work is not to find the exit. The work is to become the kind of being for whom the question no longer arrives as a weight, because the life it describes has been genuinely claimed. That is the inner movement the eternal return was designed to initiate. Not consolation, not acceptance, not the careful arrangement of suffering into something bearable, something harder, something more rare. The full inhabitation of a single moment, one moment entirely yours, uncurated, unescaped, unconditionally entered. That is what Nietzsche was asking for. That is what the demon's question, heard correctly, has always been asking for. The eternal return doesn't ask whether you'd survive your life again. It asks whether, even once, you've lived a moment that was entirely yours. Most people haven't, and Nietzsche knew it. If this resonated with you, come find me at luminaryflow.com. There's a free gift waiting for you there, and you'll also receive my newsletter with thoughts and inspiration behind each video. You'll find the link in the top comment below.